Thank you so much for taking your seats. Thank you so much for taking your seats. We're going to start the wrap up of day one. Um, Please make sure that once you head to the special sessions, afterwards we're going to have a breakfast outside. Also, if you haven't been to the dinner yesterday, kindly come see us at registration to take your giveaway vouchers. Thank you so much.
On? Now it's on. Yeah, lovely. All right. Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the second day. I think it was a very nice first day. I've learned a lot. I've been to all of these conferences that I really enjoy, and they're really cross-cutting. And I think some of the themes that emerge in the discussion is the jobs challenges these days go really beyond what we, let's say, traditionally have thought about, like labor market policy. So maybe like 20 years ago, there's a lot of talk only about labor regulations, employment protection, minimum wages. Now we see that there are tons of cross-cutting issues where we essentially think about the interactions between growth, between infrastructure, between public finance, and how they impact on good jobs or decent jobs. We switch between these two terms. Like yesterday, we had a World Bank session, which was more about good jobs. Today, we'll have the ILO session, which will be more about decent jobs. So maybe at some point, most of us will understand where do these concepts over, like a Venn diagram at some point maybe will be created. I think I really enjoyed this about the conferences, that we really touch upon a wide range of issues. I also would like to thank the local organizers for an amazing dinner and the culture program yesterday. I'm pretty sure that for the next 10 years or so, nobody will organize like a dance performance at Jobs and Development Conference, because if you do that in any other place, then everybody will be like, have you seen the Cairo one? So dance performances are like off the table for the next few, because I'm not sure you can beat that. So today we're gonna have two special sessions right after when I finish, which will be very soon. The one is here. This is the ILO session on the human-centered economy. The other one, which is the GLM LIC special session on women's employment, will be in room P008, which is, I think, one of those that we used yesterday. So in about 30 seconds, when I shut up, those of you who want to join the other session, let's just go there immediately so we don't get too much delay. And there will be this break and a photo after the special session. So let's reconvene for the photo before the coffee break. As somebody who has quite a bit of experience with photography, I can tell you the photo will be outside, I guess. We should go there like 2 minutes or 3 minutes before we actually take a photo, because otherwise all of us will look like that. So go there a little bit earlier so you get accustomed to a lot of the sun, because otherwise it's going to look very, very weird. All right, then we'll have a bunch of parallel sessions, which again will be some of technology, some we have, I think, one more on gender. So without taking much more time, enjoy the second day. Then if you want to join the other session, I will actually, so you can follow me to the room for the other session, and I welcome to the stage Harun, Richard, and Gary for the session here, right? Thanks so much.
going to be here, don't worry. Just, it's for your convenience. If it's more convenient for you, then
So, we don't really need timekeepers, do we? Or do we keep, because I'm just going to give them 30 minutes and 15 and then 15 for questions.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's fine.
I have a presentation here.
Welcome, everybody. By the second day of the conference, we try and make it less formal. But that being said, Gary has asked, and it's Gary asking, not me, that you all gather in the middle if you would like to, so that we all together. And he's going to lead the charge. What we will do in this wonderful session called the Human-Centered Economy, led by Rick Sammons, is I will introduce both speakers. Let Rick speak for 30 minutes, although he says he doesn't need that long, and then Gary will respond for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open for questions. This being electronic-only conference, I didn't print out the bio, so I have it on my phone, so apologies if I'm reading off my phone. But to be clear, Rick Sammons is director of the ILO's research department. I think outgoing, as his term has ended, and he served as its Sherpa to the G20, G7, and the BRICS processes. He served previously as founder and chairman of the Climate Disclosure Standard Board, a managing director of WEF, the World Economic Forum, and DG of the Global Green Growth Institute. He worked in the US government as special assistant to the president for international economic policy and national security Council Senior Director for International Economic Affairs, and that was in the Clinton-Gore administration. And he was also an economic advisor to the US Senate Democratic leader, Thomas Daschle, if that's correct. And Rick, of course, has numerous publications, so that's the reason he's at this conference, just because of his long list of, long pedigree of publications, including areas on international trade, financial, environmental, labor, and development issues, as well as corporate and global governance. And he's been a member also of the UN SG's Task Force on Digital Financing for the SDGs, the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work, and many, many others. I got to know Rick, who asked me to join the ILO's Research Reference Group, which is trying to gather academics to evaluate and monitor the ILO's research, and it's been a wonderful experience. I'm going to quickly go ahead and introduce Gary, who probably needs no introduction, but just to be clear, Gary is recently retired, but he was for a long time the John P. Windmiller Professor of International and Comparative Labor and Professor of Economics at Cornell. He was also the program coordinator, which is really important for this conference, of the ISA program on labor and development, and hence Gary's very much the spirit behind the conference in its initial phases as he brought ISA into this conference. I don't think Gary's work needs any reminder, but this to be very clear. He won the 2014 ISA Prize in Labor Economics, which I think is known to many of us. And of course, he's been an Ivy League teacher, both at Yale and then at Cornell for over 50 years. He's got a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. And he became an assistant professor at Yale at the age of 25 and an associate professor at 29. So you know what the benchmark is for the younger attendees here. 2 years later, he joined Cornell and has been there ever since. Gary's probably one of the most prolific authors on labor economics in developing countries. I remember reading his Harris and Todaro series of papers when I was much, much younger, and thinking, well, this is a gentleman I need to emulate, which I haven't, but at least meet, which I have. So, but specifically, Gary's produced over 200 books and articles published by MIT Press. Everybody knows his Working Hard, Working Poor book, but there have been many others. And of course, has published in the standard sort of top journals, including AER, QJE, Review of Economics and Statistics, Econometrica, and so on. So we have a wonderful pairing of two excellent speakers. I'm going to hand over to Rick, and he will have 30 minutes, and then Gary to respond. Thanks very much.
I'll use this, but then we'll need to switch to the other presentation. So I'll just signal to you. Okay? It's also open right here. Okay. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. It's such a nice pleasure to be here today at this remarkable conference, which has a long and, I think in the field, illustrious record of elucidating a lot of relevant issues. And particularly want to thank all of the organizers that you saw on the gorgeous motif that we had earlier, all the institutional organizers. And a special thanks to Haroon and Gary. It's particularly a pleasure and an honor to be in a panel with two of the leading lights in labor economics in the world. What I'm going to do today is to try to complement a bit much of the discussion at the conference, which appropriately looks at particular aspects of labor markets and jobs, decent work. And I might just put in a little parentheses here that on this notion of decent jobs and good jobs, 187 governments in the world have signed on to the notion of decent work, decent jobs. It's in the SDGs. You won't find good jobs, which is not a very well defined. There is a definition of decent work, which I'm not going to spend time on here, but just so people know, that little footnote of the phraseology, if you will, or the conceptualization of the field. What I'm going to do today is to talk based on a recent piece of research, a book that I put out several months ago. It's an authored piece of work published by an academic publisher in association with the ILO. So it is not an official standard or tripartite framework by the organization, but it's a piece of research. But it's, I think, particularly relevant to this conference and to this year. This happens to be the 80th anniversary of a very important part of the ILO's constitution, which is something called the Declaration on Philadelphia. This was a multilateral accord setting an agenda for the ILO, which was a multilateral organization that predated the UN system and predated the Bretton Woods institutions. And we're in its 80th anniversary, so we've had some reflection about that. But what's interesting is that declaration set a logical hierarchy of economics, of economic progress, if you will. And it framed in very clear and pretty elegant language the notion that an economy is a social construct. And it's there basically to promote, advance development, in its broadest sense. The life of people, their livelihoods, their agency, their dignity, and the like. And I think that's something I would just posit here for a moment, because that language, which was agreed only 2 months before the Bretton Woods conference, was reflected in the first articles of agreement of both the bank and the fund. That logical hierarchy, and you also see it in the Havana Charter, and then in the GATT, and later in the WTO. In the first article, it's about sustainable development. It's not about trade per se. It's not about productive output per se. These are means to advancing development and development of people. This book is a long reflection on that logical hierarchy, and the way that economics has developed, particularly macroeconomics has developed over the decades and indeed centuries. There's a history of economic thought chapter in the book that goes back, in fact, to the founding fathers. They were men by and large. of liberal economics. Let me start by just observing that there are a lot of, in the last 15 years, since the great financial crisis, there has been a crescendo of agreement politically around the world, but also the heads of technical organizations like mine and others, that we need to basically shift the growth and development model. This is framed in very aspirational terms, and you see a number of them on the board here. You know, make growth more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. Accelerate progress on the SDGs. The SDGs can be viewed as essentially a large agenda to modulate, to adapt the growth and the development model, if you will, so that you have better outcomes in some of these areas of social inclusion, environmental sustainability, human and systemic resilience in particular. And then put in more maybe technical terms, there's been a long-standing drumbeat, which was reinforced after the great financial crisis and then reinforced in the SDG exercise in the Paris Agreement in 2015, that we need to do a better job, a more systematic job of internalizing social and environmental externalities in business and economics. And we have had quite a discussion within the ILO over the years about the need to renew social contracts to reduce inequalities in a secular way and secure social justice for all, which I'm not going to define, and our organization has never defined, I would add, in this regard. But my point here is that there's a deafening agreement on the direction for a change in the development model, if you will. And it implies moving away from the narrower focus on improving allocative efficiency and capital accumulation. These are the sort of building blocks of the standard model of improving productive output, which I would emphasize remains extremely important. That is foundational. There's no question about the fact that a country that has very limited resources has a hard time providing jobs and improving living standards for its people on a sustainable basis. Growth is critically important. But what we're hearing from the designated leaders of society around the world is that that's not sufficient. That's necessary, but not sufficient. So this consensus political agenda that I've just summarized here over the last 15 years implies a replacement of quote-unquote neoliberalism, which has a very strong focus on getting your allocative efficiency and right and improving the conditions for accumulation of capital and the like, and its international corollary, if you will, the so-called Washington consensus. One way of framing that is to say that, well, we need a more human-centered, in other words, something that is focused not just on production, but on progress in living standards. I like to think of these as the top and the bottom line of economic progress. You need, just like in business, and we're here at American University where you've got a very strong integration of the business community, you need top-line growth, a business person will tell you, in order to sustainably improve your bottom line, your profits. You know, if you're not improving revenue over time, you're probably not going to improve there's only so much you can do to reduce your costs, right, to boost your profits. You need to grow the bit. Well, it's an analogous concept for the economy. That growth is a top-line concept. It's necessary, it's needed, but that composition of growth and what it results in terms of people's improvement in people's lives, that's the bottom line. That's economic progress. That's living standards, particularly at the median, the household living standards on the ground. Now, maybe let me move on here. Now, so a fairly large gap remains between that consensus international political agenda, this directional agenda, and the action on the ground. Yes, there's been very important progress in various corners of the world economy. There's no question about that. But we can see that we're way off track in terms of the systemic shift that leaders have called for. And I argue that this is not just a failure of political will. In a way, the economics community, both academic and policymaking, advisory, has been struggling to respond to this shift, this desired shift in direction. And we've yet to adapt the model itself, growth and development model or models, obviously there's no monolithic model per se, to these circumstances and targets and goals that have been set. I personally think that this is analogous to the doctrinal cul-de-sac that the field was in the 30s, in a very different environment, where the profession struggled to get out of its current mental model and to be able to respond better to the huge gap in employment, output gaps of the time. And it made it through, but there was a tremendous soul searching at the time to figure out how to help governments escape the trap, if you will. It's just that was a very acute and severe one. This is more of a slow-moving, a slow-burning one, in my opinion. So this book sets about trying to go back to the basics of the issue and think about, is this inherent in the field? Need it be that we focus basically on the top line and view the bottom line, the median progress in household living standards, as more of a residual considerations? Or did the field wander off the trail at some point in its historical evolution? When I talk about inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, these are different facets of a standard of living. And they don't really appear in the core mental model of growth and development, which is mainly about improving production of goods and services. And that's worth interrogating a bit. One way of thinking about this is to think of an analog to the output gap. Economies will tend to have an output gap, larger or smaller. They will be closer or farther from their growth potential. Their economic teams and scholars will focus on different ways to narrow that output gap to improve their growth potential. And this book poses the question, should we be thinking in analogous terms about the bottom line? Is there a gap on the bottom line, what I call a social welfare gap? And in other words, should we be thinking in more structural, organized terms about how to structurally improve the diffusion of gains to median household living standards from growth, and in ways that narrow the output gap or raise growth along the way? Are we missing opportunities in other aspects of the conduct of economic policy that are two-for-one opportunities, things that would improve both the diffusion of improvement in living standards from growth, but also would cycle back in a positive feedback loop into strengthening the foundations of growth itself? And the book responds to that question by saying, yes, actually there are quite considerable things that many economies are missing in this regard. So I kind of, in order to help think this through, I present a simple model of household living standards. 5 main channels or facets by which household living standards improve as part of an economy's development and progress. And I break them into, you see them on the board here, employment and an entrepreneurial opportunity. That's one way an improvement in living standards gets expressed at the household level. Disposable income, availability and affordability of material necessities, which particularly for poor countries is a big, a giant part of what they view to be their standard of living. economic security, which you can think of as social protection, basically protection against adverse events or misfortunes that lead to a pause in income and earnings, and environmental security. And these 5 dimensions, one can think of the social welfare gap as there is no ideal, right? You don't just maximize one. So what I've tried to do is, with this model, is present a pragmatic or practical approach to stylizing what I call a social welfare gap. And that is the distance from the frontier of peer countries, of their outcomes and enabling policies and institutional features in these areas. And if you take that empirical approach, this concept begins to take on a little bit more concrete form, because, and here, we'll switch slides in a moment just to signal to the colleagues here. If you look at peer groups of countries, take the World Bank's 4 income levels of groups of countries by level of development, low, lower middle, upper, and you plot their performance in a number of dimensions that bear heavily upon these 5 aspects of household living standards, you see a very wide dispersion in performance among countries at the same level of economic development. This is not an aggregate worldwide approach, such that for many of them, the difference is typically between 3 times and 6 times between the low performer in that particular income category of countries and the median. And typically the difference in performance between the median performer and the 80th percentile one, which you might think of as leading practice or good practice, is 0.5 to 3x difference. So yes, of course, countries have different circumstances, political cultures, historical considerations, which are inevitably going to lead to different practices and degrees of emphasis in one area of public policy or another, or institutional investment or another. But these are quite striking. If we could switch to the other slide. I'm not sure who to ask here. I thought he was going to be there. Anyway, so I have in the book, you will see some reference ranges for a number of these. Well, the gentleman was, maybe this is not going to work, but there is another slide, if Heba is here or someone, I'll come back to it, which will show for a variety of aspects of policy and institutional strength that matter for this, whether it be the gender wage gap or the collective bargaining rate or the NEAT, the number of, yes, can you help me with this?
So, yeah, this one.
No, it's a completely different PowerPoint. Okay, don't worry about it. Thank you.
So maybe I can try.
And you will see.
Is it that one?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. So perhaps, and then we'll switch back in just a minute if you could stay by me here. So this is a visualization of what I'm talking about here. Let's take, because you can see it on the screen here, the collective bargaining rate, which is heavily influenced by policy and institutional setup. Yes, by history and culture as well. But you will see in the chart, the low, median, which is red, 80th percentile, and top. The 80th percentile is green. So for countries at every level of economic development, you have a very wide variance in performance. And if you go down to, for example, if I can get it here, looks like it's not going to be so easy. I've done this I've put together reference ranges of basically policy and institutional effort or strength in a number of areas. Let's take a look at the NEAT rate, which is strongly influenced by policy and investment levels in people in this aspect at the younger. There is a very wide variation among countries in almost every income category here. What does that mean? It means that there's unutilized policy space for virtually every country on one or more facets of household living standards. There is a gap, a social welfare gap, if you will, that is in significant part a function of missed opportunities for policy. Why is that? Lots of reasons, but certainly a contributing factor, I posit, is that our mental model of growth and development, there's nowhere do you find this in the production function. Nowhere do you find these considerations internalized in the growth and development model. It really comes out more, it's viewed more as a function of a political economy, if you will. And unless you think about this in a structured, systematic fashion, I think countries have a tendency to underemphasize the institutional underpinnings of inclusive, sustainable, and resilient development. That's what the point of this presentation is about. There are more parameters that you can find in the book in this regard. And now we'll try to switch back to the text. So the conclusion from this empirical evidence is that we as a profession, academic as well as policymaking, have chronically underemphasized the role of this diverse institutional ecosystem, the things that influence, that shape the diffusion of household living standards through these 5 channels over time. And that, as a result, we are missing opportunities to capture better synergy between production and distribution. Distribution in a broad sense of the term, in terms of the social quality of growth, not just the quantity or GDP of growth, if you will. So the norms, policy, incentives, and public administrative capacity in these domains, and here you see under the first bullet, a listing of some of the main areas of policy and institutional strength that matter for this, is what I call the de facto income distribution system, or more appropriately labeled living standards diffusion mechanism underpinning market economies. It's this institutional dimension that we need to increase the emphasis on. We can't forget about the production function, the need to do what we can to improve allocative efficiency and improve investment, particularly capital investment, productive capacity. That remains very important. I want to reemphasize that. But we have historically had an unbalanced view. I like to say that it's, look, we've been looking, and look, I'm an American, and the U.S. Academic tradition is as much responsible for this as any in recent decades. I'm talking about macroeconomists. I'm not really talking about labor economists, by the way. But it's as if we've been training ourselves and training others to look at economies with one eye closed, through only one eye. Yes, the production function, that part of the mental model of development is critically important, particularly for poor countries. It's vitally important for poverty reduction, no question about it. But particularly as countries go through middle income, let alone high income levels, these distributional and resilience and sustainability transitions, these become extremely important for societies. That social quality of growth, that needs to come into increasing focus. I would argue that it's also vitally important for low-income countries to focus on. But it's even, the disconnect is even more when you move into higher income, middle and higher income countries. And so I believe that just as we all, when we can only see through one eye, we have less depth of field and a constrained peripheral vision. I argue that the standard teaching of macroeconomics, liberal economics, has similarly for many decades, and you could say this is neoliberalism if you want to put a political term on it, but I prefer to speak more academically about it, that we have been we've been constraining our depth of field and our field of vision by only looking at economies, or maybe only is not the right word, but certainly predominantly looking at economies through the production function mental model of economic growth and development. And the second bullet is critical because many of the areas of institutional strength and investment and policy incentives actually are a 2-for-1 for growth, for both distribution and production. If you reduce discrimination in terms of people being able to find and get given a job as a function of their personal characteristics. If you reduce, in other words, if you do things like many countries have been doing to improve gender participation, women's participation in the workforce, or to reduce racial discrimination, you're broadening labor force participation on a structural basis. That's a determinant, a fundamental determinant of growth. If you're doing a better job of skilling your people, both at the young end, and that goes to the NEET rate, but in terms of basic education, making sure more of your kids get through a quality secondary education so they reach a basic level of numeracy and literacy, that investment is a 2-for-1. It both improves the diffusion, widens the circle of inclusion in the economy, but it also improves productivity growth. And I could go on through many other things that matter for those policies that matter for these areas of living standards at the median level. Many of them, not all of them, many of them are 2-for-1s that improve both your production function and what I call aggregate distribution function, performance of the economy. Therefore, the book, I argue that this ought to be viewed as in effect, a function, a system. Most of the time, we look at this as individual areas of policy, and we look at a sort of a narrow view of how we're doing in this, but it actually operates as a system, and therefore deserves to be treated as a function per se. So let me now try to move toward the end by just representing this in notation here, which is essentially saying what I said before. There's a caveat at the bottom. There's no presumption here, no pretension, that this is a mathematical function. In other words, the combination of the two, the production side and this living standards diffusion function, what I call an aggregate distribution function, together it is the two of them that yields the bottom line, which is aggregate social welfare progress. And so I call this the aggregate social welfare function of an economy. That's what economic progress is really about, social welfare, not productive output per se. But this is not a mathematical function. This is a heuristic. The right hand and the left hand side are measuring different things or are framing different things. It's a mental model. And therefore we have to be, and by the way, that's the aggregate production function originally was thought it might be a mathematical function, but frankly, there was tremendous debate, and at the end of the day, I think the resolution is that it too is not a mathematical function. It's a mental model, a very helpful one, by the way, but a mental model. So let me end with that. Maybe I'll end with one thought, and that is that I mentioned that there's a history of economic thought chapter in the book. And my point here is that if you go back in time to the most influential original theorists and codifiers of liberal economics, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Alfred Marshall, who's the great link into neoclassical economics, if you look at their writings, and I parse this in the chapter, they actually had this two-lens. They were very clear at articulating this two-lens model, looking at both things that markets to improve efficiency and productive output on the one hand, but also they spelled chapter and verse many of the same areas of living standards related institutional strength, and much of which they are explicit in saying the government has a critical role to play in laying that out. So in a way, this is back to the future, and what I'm laying out here, and I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Just make sure I stay on time. Thank you very much, Rick. I think you gave a wonderful introduction to your idea of human-centered economics. And I want to say to you, and I want to say to the audience, I'm 100% behind it. I think that human-centered economics is the way to go. We want to think of what we're advocating in terms of its effects on people, and not just simply its effects on macroeconomic aggregates like GDP growth or balance of payments or government debt or any of these other things that are that macroeconomists consider. So my comments are on the positive side. I'm with you. I have some specific ways of saying some of the same things differently and to try to narrow in on a very broad and wide-ranging framework that you've laid out for us. And so it sometimes is said there are two kinds of people, those who put things into two categories and those that don't. And, and I'm one of those people that tries to cut to the chase and say, look, here's what I believe in. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but in any case, here's what I want you to take away from this. So what I'm going to try to do is take some of these same ideas and use some of the terms and that I've been working on and including from time to time, and try to leave people with a sense that we should be doing things differently from the way that we sometimes do. So what do we sometimes do that I would say we want to change? What I took away from reading the book, and I didn't know what Rick was going to say when he gave his presentation. The presentation, of course, is based on the book and emphasizes, to me, somewhat different things, elaborated on it in a useful kind of way. And my takeaways were three things. That the essence of your argument is, first of all, what we need is a new economics. And the new economics takes us away from just simply macroeconomic growth per se. This new economics should be human-centered. And we want people to be central to how we conceive of our economic analysis and our economic policies. And the third major takeaway that I derive from the book is that the standard indicator of how well an economy is doing, that is the growth of GDP, should be supplemented by an additional consideration of the for whom question in economics. When I studied Samuelson's economics textbook as a kid, the questions were what, how, and for whom. And this question of for whom somehow got lost along the way in what the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal view, the things you were talking about, they somehow caused us to lose sight of that, and we want to bring those back in. Okay, so in my own words, what I would say is that that equating economic analysis with macroeconomics is, to my mind, a misunderstanding of certainly what this conference is all about, because we are very much concerned about the human side of economic development. And I'll talk about definition of economic development in just a minute. I think personally, I'm not a macroeconomist, and there's a good reason I'm not, because I don't see that for the questions I'm interested in, which is how do we improve people's material standards of living, especially those people whose standards of living are unacceptably low, I don't think that macroeconomics offers a whole lot in terms of formulating questions and those questions and policies to try to address those problems. So what I am unabashedly a labor economist, so I'm concerned about labor markets and how they work and people as workers. And I figure that the reason for that is that people, take ourselves. Most of us don't rely for our standard of living on what we receive from the government or a society. We rely on our paychecks. And once we have earned an adequate income, we are able to take that income and we can go out and buy the things we want, and we lead pretty good material lives. And so the labor market intervention is how can more people be working, earning better livelihoods so that they can overcome the constraints on their standards of living and achieve better livelihoods, get out of economic misery. Okay, that's the way that I would put the labor economics part of it. Development economics. Development economics is sometimes defined as the study of developing countries. I much prefer to think of it as the study of development processes, in developing countries, but also it makes a lot of sense to talk about the economic development of countries like my own, the United States. And to say, yeah, we have some development shortfalls, and we need a better kind of policy for the economic development of our own country. And so with that in mind, let me distinguish between growth and development. Okay. Growth, my definition is completely standard. It is the economy is producing more goods and services, and that was the first of your two functions, the aggregate production function. And the aggregate production function, as you quite rightly say, is limited by the fact that it only is talking about how much, but not for whom. And so that second part deals with the for whom, and then the feedback from distribution to the amount of aggregate economic activity. That's a very useful construct, and I like the way that you put that. Okay, so the standard definition of economic growth is that the economy is producing goods and services. Growth is when it produces more goods and services than before, so that there is more available for to reach people and perhaps improve their standards of living. So what is economic development? Economic development for me is not economic growth. Economic growth may help spur economic development, but for me, economic development is overcoming economic underdevelopment. Underdevelopment is the existence of, to use a technical economics term, a severely constrained choice set. People are choosing from a limited range of options. And if you have a very limited range of options, the best choice you can make is going to be a very limited outcome or set of outcomes. The process of economic development I see as relaxing those constraints so that people in general, and in particular poor people, I focus on poor people, you focus on the median person. That's, I think, a small difference. The important thing is we're trying to get people throughout the income distribution, not worry too much about those at the top, but do worry a lot about those in the middle at the bottom, to achieve better economic standards of living than they had been able to before the economic growth and the economic development took place. So that's what I see as what economic development is all about. And so how might we consider economic growth in that context? Economic growth may be, and note the emphasis on may be, a means of achieving economic development. But in order for it to be a means of achieving economic development, there must be some channel going from what is produced to people and their incomes and their consumption. So what are those channels? Again, putting things into two categories. One category is that the people may get their incomes from what the work they do and how much they earn for the work they do. And if the economic growth that takes place doesn't result in more and better jobs, that's the slogan of this conference, if it doesn't result in that, then that channel is closed and economic growth may not lead to economic development, but there may be a second one. And the second one may be that economic growth results in more government programs of a kind where the government doesn't provide people with incomes, but it provides them with housing or health care or nutritional programs or the kinds of things that can help improve their standards of living in that way. If you have a government that doesn't care about jobs and doesn't care about social programs for the people, there's a good chance that what's happening is it all goes to the cronies. And I hate to think what one of our presidential candidates in the United States would do if he's reelected and got a chance to do some of the things that he is trying to do. I don't mean this for that to be a political statement. I'm just saying that he has a different vision of the human-centeredness of his policies compared to the other party. And I think that that's an important kind of thing. All right, so economic growth, we have to think about how is this economic growth going to translate to people? And that's what Rick was talking about, with the part that, especially at the end, that he didn't have time to elaborate on. But that's very useful. Okay, what I want to do in the last couple of minutes I have is to talk about specifically a development economics perspective and a labor economics perspective on these issues, because not all development economists know labor economics or use labor economics, and not all labor economists are interested in development issues. So taking the development economics perspective, development economists are interested in aggregate growth, structural change, and productivity. The question of growth for whom is now central to development economics. You can't do development economics, well, you can. You can't, I was going to say, you can't do development economics today without being concerned about the question of growth for whom, but some people do. And I think that that's deficient, and that's probably because those people are too macroeconomic for my taste. But that's me speaking. I told you, I'm giving you my perspective on these issues, which is very, very, very much consistent with Rick's. Clarifying the objectives of development, I think I would put it as, first and foremost, poverty reduction, first and foremost for me, and inclusive growth, which may be economic growth not for the poor, but for the near poor, the bottom 40%, or however it is you conceive of that. And so development economists are fond of thinking about which way is up. What do we mean by development? How do we know we have more development? And the idea of producing more and making sure that it reaches the target group, I think, is what characterizes modern development economics, not the development economics that I never took as a student. The first time I was in a development economics classroom was when I got up in front of a group of students and started teaching about the subject. And I started with my version then. That was a long time ago. Everything I do was a long time ago. Started a long time ago. And, but I think that if that we want to supplement the macroeconomics that people learn in the core of economics by development economics. Development economics would benefit from more people doing labor economics. So what does that mean? Development economics tends to think in terms of L, right? You have Q, output is a function of capital K and labor L. And development economists don't distinguish between the L that is supplied and the L that is demanded. L is L. And I don't like that. The labor economists have a very different model. I do that. A labor supply curve, a labor demand curve, a wage determination process. The wage determination process may be that supply and demand determine the wage at that intersection point. It may be that supply and demand do not determine the wage, that the wage is determined by unions, minimum wages, other kinds of things above that intersection point. Modern labor economics and modern development economics have market clearing segments and non-market clearing segments coexisting side by side. And what happens in one segment of the labor market affects and is affected by what happens elsewhere. And so this idea of dealing with labor markets in those terms is fundamental to labor economics and is not fundamental to development economics. So what do I do? What does this conference do? We bring together the tools of development economics and the tools of labor economics to try to come up with a better analysis of what is going on in terms of economic development than either of those two disciplines does alone. Okay, so that is the challenge that I want to end with, is to say that if that's what we're trying to do, then having the insights from what Rick has taught us in his book and in his lecture today, and to try to pick up on some of the things that I just wanted to leave you with my own words, of my own take on things, I think is the way for our field of jobs and development to progress. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gary and Rick. So we'll open for questions. I think we have 5 to 8 minutes, so the floor is yours. One from Federico. Maybe we could take a few, so if there are any other hands, keep them up. 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for the presentation. Very interesting. I work for the World Bank. So this is an open question for you to share with us your reflections on a challenge that we've been trying to deal with, and so do you. So what I totally agree with what you presented today, right? So we need a whole of economy approach. When we think about jobs, it's multidimensional, right? Exactly because we want that strategy, we want that process to be inclusive. But my question is to share your reflections on how we get there. And I'm saying that because we've been trying to deal with that challenge, and there is no one solution, but at least we've been thinking of an approach. So your welfare gap, I think, is very helpful because it's always important to know where we go. And compare countries, we know how much that is important. But those are 5 outcomes that you have in your welfare gap. And, with the other presentation, you show, and I think we all know that we haven't really been able to move the needle that much when it comes to decent work, or better jobs, like how we call it. So we've been thinking, okay, given the multidimensionality, how we go about policies, right? Because in the end, the difficulty with the jobs agenda is that there is no one policy. Because of the multidimensionality, you need a combination of policies, and that becomes a job strategy. So that job strategy is difficult. So we've been working on a Job4Development flagship report. We presented a couple of times to the ILO that we try to think what could be a suitable policy organizing framework, right? And that we have production people places to show that it's not just about, let's improve the production of goods and services, but we need the people dimension, now we need the connectivity and climate. We come up with 3 principles about it: the inclusivity, complementarity, and short and long term. But then, at some point we have to deal with, how do we prioritize? Like when you meet with the minister, like you need to have a strategy that is also an evolving strategy. So again, I'm sharing a challenge. I don't have a solution for it, despite us having, progress on organizing the policy. So just to share with us your reflection, how do you get to those 5 outcomes? In terms of process, country example, whatever you can share with us, I think would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cristina Fernandez. I have been lately working in micro business, and I think that we should put a stronger effort in understanding what's happening there, because I think that they consume an important part of labor in these countries, and they are tremendously unproductive, and they are the heart of a lot of problems of social poverty, social problems, because not only their workers are poor, but only entrepreneurs are poor. And you can find the heart of a lot of problems there. But on the other way, so people say, well, what we should do is that make these people be employed by the large companies, and that's not happening because there is not the demand for that. And you cannot say, well, or we should empower the micro firms and make them more productive, so they're going to be better. But it's the ways to make these firms more productive is also complicated. So you cannot help and say, well, so we are just going to cover these people by Social Security. I mean, it's a difficult way to to find a way of those people to develop. So I wonder if you can, work on that.
Yes. Yeah, good morning. I am Greta Catoceti, ILO colleagues from the Cairo office here. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a comment and a question. You have identified the five key dimensions of the social welfare gap. And in this effort to bring in together the different dimensions, the economics, the political, and the policy dimension, how do you see, on what role can play at different levels social dialogue and multilateralism in providing this solution to this gap, which probably is linked to the question that our colleague from the World Bank asked. And regarding the policy work that we do and the standard setting organization that we are, how do you think this kind of work, which is a medium long-term work, can actually respond to the ever-changing, rapid changes, the pace of these changes and in the world of work? Thank you.
So thank you, Richard and Gary, for incredible reflections. My name is Ricardo Santos from UNU Wider. I'm based in Mozambique. And my questions are, so looking into the welfare, the social welfare gap, and my question when I thought about it was thinking about kind of like a social production function or frontier, and where would countries sit there, and how would we be able to then recommend measures to move them closer to the frontier or along the frontier towards. So one of the questions for me is how to measure all of these indicators, is one of the questions. And the other that I found interesting is in the function that you present in the conceptualizing function, whether those right-hand side components, so the ones that are not in the production function, whether they actually are in the technology side of the production function, and whether that kind of links both things together.
Well, I'm sitting here also thinking that my colleague here must have a number of comments. Given the time, I'm going to try to hunt him down this conference and engage. But thank you very much for your questions. Let me say, first of all, that this is an open access book. So there's a synopsis with a link to the book, the ebook version of the full book, over there and over there on the tables if you're interested. And some of the questions are related, and they come to yours a bit. Well, okay, if this is what I would call a better mental model of growth and development, more balanced one, great. Concepts are important, but the real world asks the question, how to? How do you sequence? How do you prioritize? How do you navigate the political economy of it all, et cetera? So that's how I interpret your question. I'm very much from the applied world. As Haroon described, I've spent a lot of time working in organizations, advising decision makers and the like. So I think about that as well. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is that I felt that there was too much of a reflex baked in the cake of the more one lens model that people have been taught for decades now. And that what is needed as a first step is a discipline. And the reason I laid out this aggregate social welfare function with this aggregate distribution function component is that if people had that mental map and policymakers in a government understood that they may well have a significant social welfare gap and that there's a way to break that down, and there's a practical way, empirically, to get some signals as to where you may have the biggest welfare gap by looking at your peer group of countries' performance and enabling policies. That's a good place to start. That type of discipline, I've laid this all out. I didn't have a chance to say it in the presentation. I believe that this is a framework for instilling a discipline on policymakers and their international organization advisors to look at the empirics of institutional deepening much more systematically when they're analyzing and advising on the growth and development model of a country. What does that mean in more specific terms? I would be advising that it's going to differ for every single country, right? On both where they stand relative to their peers and also their own historical, institutional particularities, if you will. But I would start with an analysis of where they do stand relative to their peer group in many of these dimensions. And what I think we need to do next as a profession, and I would like to see the ILO and others do, is to be able to fill out what you were calling that social production function, not theoretically, but with the tools to make more readily available that comparative data for these different areas of policy and institutional strength that connect to those 5 aspects of living standards. So we're beginning to do that a little bit. The ILO is planning to put out and Haroon will know this, a State of Social Justice report, flagship report next year, a very challenging undertaking. But as part of that, we're hoping to put a database behind it that picks up on, that gives countries a sense of where they stand through data visualizations like this on how they're doing on NEAT or collective bargaining rate or social spending as a share of GDP or social protection. That's a signal already to begin that process. Once you're in that process of looking at the institutional side of the economy as well as the production side of the economy and the enablers thereof, then I think you've actually rebalanced the thought process. And so that's a general way to respond to your comment. But out of that analysis will begin to come, I think, a clearer sense of what makes sense. What are the high priority or most feasible opportunities to narrow the gap by investing more in policy and incentives in the different dimensions in a way that helps with the job creation strategy. So that's also how I would respond to your question. I think I view this not as the end of the story. I argue in the book that this opens a vista for a very significant new phase of a research agenda for the economics community. And I like to say that just because that aggregate distribution function is not a mathematical function does not mean it's impervious to sophisticated empirical analysis. And that's the prize here. There's also a chapter in the book which I did not speak at all about what does it mean for international cooperation? What does it mean for how we, the bank, the ILO, the IMF, and others, what does this 2-lens mental model of growth mean for us programmatically individually, and how we need to be better networked into working together? Because the ILO happens to be the one with the deepest data by and large and the most normative work on certain aspects of that. The bank, you span everything, but we need to connect that much better. And I believe that the policy surveillance that's done, the fund has an Article 4 process that looks at macroeconomic considerations, macroeconomics stability. In my view, if we accepted this as a mental model, a rebalanced 2-lens model, you would have a policy surveillance, a development advisory process by international organizations that were combining our relative competences in the different facets of living standards. So you wouldn't just have an Article 4 that's purely focused on macro. You'd also be doing a scan of the institutional strength or weaknesses, relatively speaking, of the country, and that would filter into an integrated, not just an IMF set of advice or the bank advice or the ILO advice. That would give them, and we need a mechanism for that. Because right now we're too segmented in the work that we do, and part of that is because we're so focused on productive output, which is vitally important, but it's missing the bottom line picture. Maybe last thing to try to quickly hit one or two of the other questions. On the micro enterprise, I agree. One of the facets, if you notice that first facet of household living standards, is not just jobs. I frame it as employment and entrepreneurial opportunity, because so many people get their labor income not from kind of a standard contract with a major firm, but through self-employment or otherwise, particularly in developing countries, but not only. And there are very important aspects, and I go through this in the 5th chapter of the book for all the dimensions of living standards. I go through the areas of enabling policy incentives and institutional strength that bear upon each, including this area. And I know that we're the International Labor Organization, but the reality is that our scope is employment, decent work, labor income more broadly, which includes the enterprise set. We have an enterprise department. So if you look at it, you will see there are different areas. Try to break it down more structurally. What are the areas that you need to form a truly robust enabling environment for this aspect of employment? I couldn't agree with you more, but don't have the time to elaborate in it. And maybe I should end there. Apologies if I haven't hit the questions, but I recognize that I probably am going over.
Great. Can please join me in thanking Rick and Gary. Excellent session. Rick is around, so please pick up on any comments. I will end by saying that death to macro is probably premature. I think there's some linkages that one can talk about, so I was holding myself back with comments. But I understand, I'm looking for the organizers. I'm looking at Sarah and Wadia. Do we go this way for tea and the photographs? Okay, so out that way and see you. Okay. So we have time. Thanks, everybody.
David.